So essentially, there's two main components. There's the research work that I do there as an ornithologist, where I am collecting data and publishing the results thereof, and I'll show you examples of that through the presentation. And then there's the overarching conservation work, which is obviously what many of us are interested in, the long-term conservation of the birds that we love so much. So let's kick into it. Let me get there. There we go. So the Seychelles, for those of you who don't know, is a archipelago of islands. There's 155 islands that make up the Seychelles. It's just sort of northeast off the coast of Madagascar, off the east coast of Africa. And then if you zoom in on that little sort of square over there, top right, that's what's over here. The main island of the Seychelles is Mahe. That's where the international airport is. You fly into there. We then fly across to Praslin onto a little island there. And then we take a small little boat for an ocean crossing to Cuisine Island, which is the island that I'm going to be talking to you about today. It's the smallest population of any African state, the Seychelles nation. Got about 110,000 people, and it is a member of the African Union. The island itself, Cuisine Island, is privately owned by a South African gentleman. It is approximately 25 hectares in size, around about 1.4 kilometers long, 800 meters wide, and about 75 meters high. So quite small, quite compact, but as you'll see through the presentation, an amazing array of diversity and huge numbers of birds that frequent this island, especially seabirds during breeding season. So the island has a mission. It's set up as a trust to safeguard its long-term ecological integrity, and the mission statement of Cuisine Island is to promote and practice nature conservation and the wise use of natural resources of the island and its surroundings, and to share this philosophy with our guests. So Cuisine Island opened its door to guests in the year 2000, offering an exclusive island experience. So it is a high cost tourism destination. So low impact but high cost, which is one of the conservation models that tourism can use. It has been honored to win numerous awards since 2000 when it opened, including the Indian Ocean's leading ecotourism destination by World Travel Awards, and World's leading green destination and World's leading private island awards. And it really has been used in case studies as kind of a textbook example of tropical island recovery. And this is the textbook that was written on the habitat recovery of this island and the subsequent restoration of the biodiversity in it. And Michael Samways, one of the authors of that, was one of my lecturers when I was a student, and so there's a long-standing association with my base university and the island. But let's show you what the island looked like before. In 1960s, it was really a coconut plantation. There was no natural vegetation on it whatsoever. There were cats on the island. There was livestock on the island. Fortunately, it had been rat-free. So there's never been rats or mice on the island. And a little bit of informal rehabilitation work started in about 1980, but the real official restoration started in 1985. So up until about 1995, the island looked pretty much like this, just coconuts and grass and cultivated lands, and not much of a biodiversity footprint. By 1998, you can start seeing the difference, some vegetated areas of more natural trees in that have been allowed to grow up and that had been planted. By 2007, you can see a lot more recovery, as well as the addition of some of the luxury chalets or villas that you can rent as a tourist. And then by 2020, that's kind of more or less what the island looks like today. Some of that vegetation is still growing, but some of it has reached already what we would call climax restoration in terms of vegetation habitat. And just to visualize this in a heat map, to show you sort of indigenous versus sort of plantation. So anything in red on this map is artificial, and anything green is natural vegetation. And you can see there that the restoration work from the 1960s through to the mid-2000s has been really successful. And it's taken a lot of effort, but it's been worthwhile. And the island owner has a philosophy of using the income from the tourism directly feeding back into the conservation. So apart from the obvious expenses of salaries and infrastructure, and that the island is not used to generate income, it's used to sustain itself through sustainable conservation tourism. Focusing a little bit more on my work there over the last 14 years, I really started off with a few students looking at the long-term influence of climate change on islands, especially on island nesting seabirds, which are one of the groups of birds that are said to be most at risk from climate change. Started doing some research on turtles, which I know are not birds, but they deserve an honorary mention because they're so cute and because they're critically endangered and really need our help. Looking at long-term monitoring of endemic land birds, and I'm going to tell you some great success stories there. I've been involved in training local conservation staff on this island and a few other islands. And then more recently, in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I've taken over the managing of the staff and the projects and sourcing staff when I'm needing staff. So the model, like I said, is high-end exclusive tourism, low numbers of tourists with a high income, and the profits fund the conservation work. Currently, we have 4 full-time conservation staff managing a large number of projects on the island. They live on the island. They're generally on a 2-year contract. They oversee ongoing rehabilitation work of the island itself from a vegetation point of view, and then have a whole lot of monitoring projects on the native fauna, especially the birds, and then looking at some of the research work that I've designed to understand the population dynamics that we can then use to actually improve the conservation projects even further, if that makes sense. So these are some of the staff that I've worked with over the years. In the bottom right-hand corner here are the couple that were originally on the island in 2010 when I first went on. And Kevin, pictured here, was actually a young conservationist that I had trained as a bird ringer or a bird bander. And that was one of the reasons why he got the job, was that he needed a bird ringing license. And so I was able to provide that. And so in return, he got me onto the island for the first time, and the rest is history because we've been successfully working there ever since. And then various other staff that have worked there over the years. It seems like somebody's drawn quite nicely over the screen, so I don't know who that was, but let's see if I go onto the next screen. It's still there. So I don't know, someone, yeah, someone's put red lines all over the screen. I don't know if you can see that your side, everyone. But that wasn't me, so we'll just deal with that. That photo there is the current staff that are on the island. So I was there a few months ago. That is me kind of third from the left, and then second from the right is actually my son, who went with me for the first time to participate in some of the conservation research and work that I run there. And the other 4 individuals are the conservation staff on the island. I did want to also just highlight Dr. Lorinda Hart, who was a postdoctoral research student of mine. She did 2 postdoctoral studies with me, one on seabirds on Cuisine Island and one on jackal buzzards in South Africa. And so some of the work I present today is from her as well. My wife, Kelly, has been across with me a few times. She's also a biologist by training, also has a PhD in zoology, and is a qualified bird ringer, and so she's been instrumental in helping me with some of my work there. I mentioned my son was over there with me, and it was really fantastic as a biologist being able to share my passion and my conservation work with my family. So let's talk some of the birds and saving species. This is a really unique story, this bird in the picture here. For those of you who aren't aware of it, this is a Seychelles magpie robin, which was probably once the rarest bird in the world. By the early 1960s, the whole population was confined to Frigate Island on the Seychelles. By the late 1970s, there were only about 16 individuals left on that one island in the world. And 7 magpie robins were introduced to Cuisine Island between October and November between 1995 and 1996, as well as on the close by Cuisine Island, owned or purchased by BirdLife International and now run by Nature Seychelles for the species. So we started on our little island with a population of 7 magpie robins. 1 died soon after the introduction, but we're now sitting at a population of 76 on Cuisine Island, and it's played a vital role as one of now 5 islands where the species occurs. The species being downlisted from critically endangered to endangered in 2007. And the species globally is now getting close to the 500 individual mark across 5 islands. And that's just a reminder from 16 individuals on 1 island. A great success story, and very much driven by BirdLife International and Nature Seychelles, the BirdLife partner in the Seychelles, and a few islands, including Cuisine, the private island that contribute to this. Really great. It's a beautiful species, and one that I'm very privileged to work on. There's a few more photos. You'll notice 2 different types of color rings on these birds. The bird on the left-hand side of the picture has old, more traditional colorings set up in a combination. You'll see the standard metal ring, and then a light blue coloring, which indicates that it's from Cuisine Island. Each of the 5 islands has a separate base color that is mixed with the metal ring. And then a combination of rings on the other leg would indicate which individual bird that is. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we swapped over to using these engraved colorings, which you can read sometimes just with a naked eye, sometimes with a camera or a pair of binoculars. And we're getting much more consistent resightings and better data with these engraved colorings. So we've moved across to that. The next photo is a very rare photo of an unringed Seychelles magpie robin on Cuisine Island, because we have every single individual ring so we can monitor them. And I actually captured this one the following day and put its bling, its jewelry on it as well. So in terms of Cuisine, there's our sort of population growth over the last 30 years or so. From a base population, the original introduction was 3 birds, then it was 6, and then all the way up now to 76 individuals. So very successful. They are spread out across 12 territories. They form family groups within their territories. And so it's important that we know exactly where these territories are. This territory map was updated in February this year. And actually, since then, we've subsequently had this territory number 4 in the orange split into a further 2 territories, because that family group got quite large. We're obviously starting to run out of space on the island, and they formed 2 separate family groups now. So we're actually up to 13 territories in our 76 birds. The next species to talk about is the Seychelles warbler. It was also once one of the rarest birds in the world. In 1959, it was only found on Cuisine Island, and there were only 26 individuals left alive. And again, some translocations occurred and reintroductions onto various islands. Cuisine being one of them. In 1990, 29 warblers were translocated to Cuisine. And by 2007, our last major census, we had 350 to 400 birds just on Cuisine Island, which was really fantastic. So that population has also successfully been established on the same 5 islands that the magpie robins are on, and it's a great example of a success story. Here's one that's a little bit less successful. This is a Seychelles white-eye. It was also restricted to a low population on very few islands, and in 2007, 20 birds were introduced into Cuisine Island, very carefully with BirdLife International and various partners. They did breed, but we had the the unusual scenario where an endangered species led to the downfall of another endangered species. So the magpie robins that I showed you just now started eating the chicks of the white-eyes. And so they would raid the nests and not enable our population to grow at all. And when I was there in 2010, I was able to see the last remaining Seychelles white-eye on the island, and it died out by about 2012. So there are no more Seychelles white-eyes on Cuisine Island, although reintroductions on other islands, some of the larger islands, have been very successful, and the population as a whole for the species is doing relatively well. I'm going to just change tack now and speak a little bit about some of the seabirds that we work with. So this is a lesser noddy, 2 lesser noddies, and we have around 55,000 pairs of lesser noddies that breed on this island. Just a reminder, this island is only 1.4 kilometers long. And we have 55,000 pairs. That's 110,000 lesser noddies that occur on the island, which is relatively insane. We've been ringing them and monitoring their breeding success for many, many years. And just this year, we had 2 really interesting ring recoveries. One just north of Madagascar on the, I forget the name of the island, but a small group of islands that are French territory. And then last year, we had a resighting on our island of a radio tracked or satellite tagged individual from the Philippines, which is really fantastic. We do also get the opportunity to observe a lot of the courtship behaviors and a lot of the natural behaviors of these lesser noddies as they're building their nests and breeding. And it's just a few quick photos. They lay a single egg, and there's one busy incubating. It can be quite comical watching them when they fly in with these large leaves that they use to build their nests. Sometimes you wonder how they can actually see where they're going. We also have brown noddies on the island. So these brown noddies, we've got ranging between about 1,100 and 1,400 pairs, so a lot less than the lesser noddies. And they can nest in a range of different habitats. Unlike the lesser noddies, who all build nests and nest in trees, brown noddies can either nest on the ground in the forest. They can breed on palm trees like this individual. They can breed on the dune crest vegetation right on the sandy shoreline where it gets exceptionally hot, and I'll show you some data from that just now. But they're also really cute, and they have 2 different color morphs of the chicks, which is quite interesting and unusual for a noddy. So you can see a normal color form of a chick in this picture here, and then there's a white color form of a chick, which happens occasionally as well, which is unusual. And I like to call this this chick on the left here a petulant teenager throwing a tantrum, because it really is begging for food and mom's not listening, and it's not happy that it's not getting its own way. But they are beautiful birds, and seeing them in flight coming into the island to feed their chicks, and that is something special to see. The cover picture to the presentation was a white-tailed tropic bird in flight. We are fortunate we have about 880 to 890 pairs at any one time breeding on the island. Unlike the noddies, who are very seasonal with their breeding, they're breeding now. Sort of the start between May and August is the breeding season for a lot of the seabirds in the Seychelles. The tropic birds and 1 or 2 other species breed all year round. And so that brings in yet another interesting dynamic in terms of population numbers and management of the species. It's a species that I really enjoy working with. They are very efficient fishers and very good parents. They do just lay an egg on the ground. They don't really build a nest. They will sometimes nest in a little tree cavity near the base of a tree as well, but generally out in the open on the ground in the forest. And this is the reason why a species like this does very poorly on islands that have been incredibly disturbed by people, where there are things like rats and mice and cats and even dogs that can impact the species when it's breeding. Obviously, they are not used to people. They have evolved in the absence of terrestrial predators on islands. And so even as a researcher, we can go and just pick them up off their nest, a free-flying seabird, and take our measurements, put the ring on, take a few other things that we work on and put them back on the nest. So it's very easy to work on the birds, but it also highlights the ease at which a species like this can get into trouble from a conservation point of view. When the egg hatches, it really looks like a little ball of cotton fluff with a head and some feet attached, and it slowly starts developing into what would be more noticeable as a tropic bird. And this is what a young fledgling tropic bird would look like after a couple of months. And then obviously once it takes off, it's a real beauty in the skies. The next species I want to talk about is called a fairy tern or a white tern. We have a population that ranges between 500 and 1,800 pairs on the island, depending on the time of the year. They also breed all year round, like the tropic birds. And we've recently started noticing a trend in our data that shows that when the noddies are present between May and August, we get reduced numbers of breeding fairy terns. When the noddies are absent over the rest of the year, that's when our fairy tern breeding numbers go up. So there seems to be a little bit of niche segregation happening between the species there. They're very inquisitive birds. They'll often come and fly above you and look at you and pose very nicely for photographs. They're also really stupid birds. They're not very clever at all. They literally just lay their egg on a branch like this. They don't make a nest and they don't have a very good strategy when it comes to breeding, especially if you consider they're breeding in a tropical environment that has monsoons with high rain and high wind. And what often happens is that in these high wind storms, the eggs will get blown off the nests or the branches that they are laid in. And so one of the conservation strategies we've used is to just put a little coconut husk on a branch and see if the birds will nest in that. And they have taken to successfully nest in that, which is really fantastic. And I'll show you some statistics just now about how that's impacted their breeding success. They really are beautiful birds with these really dark black eyes and these beautiful bright blue bills contrasting with their pure white feathers. The chicks, again, can't really take care of themselves very well. They have to sit on these precarious branches in the high winds. And the parents take a lot of effort into making sure that they don't fall off and they are able to feed them. The chicks do have slightly enlarged feet compared to chicks of other species that size, with quite large toenails, and that enables them to grip on or try to grip on to the branches on which they are finding themselves. And then they get fed by the parents, who have to spend a lot of time foraging at sea to find enough food for their chicks. Eventually, the chick will develop into something that looks like a scraggly version of the adult. And by the time they fledge, they've just still got these tan or brown feathers in the coverts and across a little wash across the body. And that's what they look like when they start flying. Just a few more photos of these majestic birds. I hope you don't mind me just putting in a few extra photos, because I really do find them fantastic birds to work with and great birds to observe. Like I said, they can get quite inquisitive, so they will come and observe us wherever we're sitting on the island and pose quite nicely. Some of these photos are taken with a cell phone, not with a fancy camera. We have a couple of species of shearwaters that breed on the island. This is a wedge-tailed shearwater. It is a species that breeds also mostly during the months of, let me just think about this, I've got to get it right for you. They're not breeding at the moment, so they're mostly summer breeders. We have about 8,000 pairs on the island. They nest in burrows underground, and they're out at sea most of the day foraging, and then in the sort of dusk and early part of the night, they come back en masse and find their burrows in the dark and come in to find their partners and their chicks. So that's the main breeding species that we have. I'll show you some other birds from the island just now. But just to touch on some of the work we've published in the last few years to document the success of this massive undertaking to rehabilitate what was a pretty agricultural intensive island to a tropical conservation paradise. And the first paper I want to just highlight came out last year or the year before, looking at just the seabird numbers and how they have changed over the last 30 years. And so you can see there from 1996 through to 2018, just 4 of the main breeding birds. The lesser noddy numbers have not changed too dramatically, but the brown noddy numbers have positively increased. The white tern numbers have positively increased, and the tropic birds in particular have positively increased their populations, which is really fantastic to see. Some of the work that we've been doing on climate change and incubation in seabirds has involved some experimental work where we've taken these fake eggs. It's basically a plastic egg that you fill with flour, which has been shown to have a very similar thermal conductance to a real egg, with a little egg temperature sensor inside there. And we would then pop it underneath an incubating bird, just replacing the bird's egg with our fake egg. And then you can see how tame the birds are, and then we would get very nice incubation temperature data from the various species in different microhabitats around the island. So there you can see a fairy tern egg on the left and the fake egg on the right, and we would pop it in a nest and remove the bird's egg and record the temperature as such. It also was we would put up camera traps and be able to get some behavioral observations of incubation shift turnovers when the females would leave and the males would come in and incubate, and look at this behavior over a 24-hour period, which is really nice. And we published this work in 2016 in the Journal of Thermal Biology, looking at how the bird's choice of a particular microhabitat in which to nest can affect the incubation temperature. And so, for example, white-tailed tropic birds would nest in the forest, so not much to compare there, but their maximum egg temperature would be 37.2 degrees Celsius. A brown noddy in a tree, its maximum egg temperature would be 37.1, so very similar to the tropic bird. The lesser noddy, 37.7, a fairy tern, 36.1. But look at the maximum temperature of a brown noddy nesting on the dune crest. So that is in an exposed environment in the sun rather than in a tree or on the ground in the forest like the rest of the birds. And remembering that the thermal limit for a bird's egg is around 40.5 degrees Celsius, you can see that on that dune crest, the birds are reaching temperatures, the eggs are reaching temperatures above that thermal critical limit, which would suggest embryonic death in some cases. And so when we're contextualizing data like this under various future climate change scenarios with 0.5 degree temperature increases, 1 degree temperature increases, you can see that when you're already sitting at the upper limit of a thermal critical temperature, any further increases could lead to a reduced breeding success in species like brown noddy that are nesting in the open on the dunes, whereas the brown noddies nesting in the trees would still be doing okay. So what it suggests is that birds can adapt to a climate change scenario just by looking at adjusting where they nest on the island, if that makes sense. Let's look at the improved breeding success of these fairy terns in our coconut husks. We published this paper in, this must have been about 2017, 2018. And it was really fantastic because what we were able to show is that the hatching success of eggs in a coconut husk would be about 65% hatching success. On a natural branch, it's only 52%. So we got a marginal increase in hatching success of eggs, but it was at the stage of the chicks that these artificial nests really came to the fore. So chicks that were in a coconut husk would have a 92% fledgling rate versus a 61% fledgling rate on a natural branch without any conservation intervention. And overall, our breeding success was doubled in the artificial nests compared to a natural nest. So quite a handy, very cost-effective conservation tool for a species like this. We also looked at the development of thermoregulation in a range of seabirds. From a climate change point of view, it's really important. A critical period in a developing bird's life is the first few weeks where it is thermally dependent on its parents. And so we looked at what age a chick was able to develop its own ability to thermoregulate. And so we would take adult cloacal temperatures and chick cloacal temperatures and correlate that with measures like mass or body size. So there's an example of a fairy tern chick that is going to get its body temperature probed. And here we have some data from lesser noddies showing that the chicks are able to thermoregulate really when they get to about 90 grams. So almost full-grown body size is when they can really start taking care of themselves from a thermal point of view. And that we published it also in journal Thermal Biology in 2017. Possibly one of the more exciting projects I've been involved with was the use of thermal imaging to measure the heat load in some of these birds nesting on islands out in the open and very exposed, very hot tropical conditions. So here's a photo of a brown noddy sitting on its egg, out exposed on a dune crest. And if we look at that same photo, but through the thermal imaging camera, and these thermal imaging cameras are very expensive, but they're really great to investigate questions like this. We can see that that point on the bird's back is sitting at 56.2 degrees Celsius. That's the heat that the feathers of the bird is getting to. And it's now trying to incubate its egg and keep its egg at 37.5 degrees Celsius. So the heat load on these birds in exposed environments is quite hectic. It's very high. And it can be up to 60, 65 degrees Celsius. The other thing we noticed when doing this work was we realized that, and from our ringing data as well, we knew that tropic birds did not develop a brood patch. So they weren't incubating their eggs and heating their eggs with their belly like a normal bird does with a brood patch. And thanks to the thermal imaging cameras, we were able to publish this paper that revealed that tropic birds, a little bit like penguins and pelicans, incubate eggs with their feet. And they form these hot patches on their feet, and they heat the eggs from underneath. And there you can see that spot on the tropic bird's foot, 35.3 degrees Celsius, helping get that egg up to 37.5 degrees Celsius. And that we published in the journal Ornithology a few years ago. The ongoing bird ringing work is incredibly important because it helps us monitor populations and trends. And actually, interestingly, just a month ago, we had our first record of a white-tailed tropic bird that I ringed in 2021, 2022, I think, in May, and it just come onto the shore of the west coast of India. And it's the first ring return in India of a white-tailed tropic bird. And here's some of the team members ringing a tropic bird and a fairy tern and a whole bunch of stuff. Some subsidiary work we're working on the island is documenting plastic pollution on the beaches. So we've been looking for about 20 years on the daily accumulation rates of litter on the beaches, and we published this in Marine Pollution Bulletin a couple of years ago. And sadly, you can see from 2003 all the way through to 2019, and it's even worse now, 2023, just the number of items per meter per day has been going up and up and up over time, which is just indicative of the plastic problem we have all around the world on our coastlines and in our oceans. And 10%, interestingly, 10% of the litter we find on beaches in the Seychelles is footwear. It's slops and flip-flops and sandals and things like that, which is quite unusual. Lots of polystyrene and lots of pieces of plastic containers and plastic bottles. I said we also train conservation staff. So this is a photo from Quezon Island, the BirdLife island next door. And whenever I'm in the country, I try to go across there and train some staff there and assist with the conservation work that they're doing there as well. So just a couple of photos to finish off some of the seabirds. There is a tropical or Audubon shearwater, We don't know how many there are on the island. Very difficult birds to find and to work on, but we do as much ringing on them as possible. We do get bridal terns on the island as well. Now and then, they don't breed every year, but we get them periodically. We do get both greater and lesser frigate bird. These are photos of greater frigate birds that don't breed on the island, but we get a fair number of immature birds every year that hang out around the island and steal food from the seabirds as often as they can. Is another photo or two of a frigate bird for us coming up. And then just a few more, the terrestrial birds, just some photos for you. It's a Seychelles sunbird, also an endemic terrestrial bird on the islands in the Seychelles. Has this beautiful little orange pectoral tuft. This is a Seychelles foddy. It's also only on 6 islands, 2 of which it had to be reintroduced to. We on Cuisine have about 350 to 400 birds. It's a forest specialist, and I'll show you some examples later, I think. No, I actually don't think I've got it in this presentation, but there is an introduced foddy as well from Madagascar, which is a grassland species. And when I first started going in 2010, the introduced grassland species predominated the populations of foddies. The Seychelles foddies were in relatively low numbers, but as the habitat restoration work has advanced and we're now reaching climax forest and the grasslands and the agricultural land is gone, we get very few of those introduced Madagascan foddies, and the indigenous Seychelles foddy is doing so much better. There is a beautiful fruit dove, the Seychelles blue pigeon, which occurs on the islands as well. They get drunk whenever they can, drinking or eating fermented fruit, and we find them dazed and kind of passed out in a state of intoxication on the floor. There's a whole lot of moorhen which have flown across and populate the island as well from some of the bigger islands. And then just quickly, because I said they're so critically endangered, this is a hawksbill turtle. It's one of the species of turtle that breeds on the island. We have a very intensive turtle management program there, where we relocate nests that are at high risk of predation by crabs or flooding by high water and spring tide oceans. And so we actually collect the eggs as they are laid. We relocate them into a dedicated turtle hatchery, which means we are able to pop those eggs and allow them to incubate naturally. And fortunately, we published a paper in December on this that showed a hatchling success in the natural nests of about 55% and a hatching success in the hatchery of between 85 and 95%, depending on the year. And so a very nice conservation intervention that's enabling us to see more baby turtles released to the ocean every year. So views like this are something that we can appreciate for many years to come because of the conservation work that's happening there. There are also giant tortoises on the island, Aldabra giant tortoises, and we have 77 individuals that are microchipped on the island, and we do a little bit of work on them and making sure that their populations are healthy and stable as well. They are quite big, as you can see, and our oldest individual on the island, if I remember correctly, is about 125 years old. So quite fantastic. It is a beautiful place to visit. It is a stunning place to do conservation work and ecological research, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that. And that brings me to the end of the talk. I hope that wasn't too long for you guys, and I hope somebody is still awake to ask a couple of questions.
Merci beaucoup. Très rapidement, je vais essayer de faire un résumé de ce que Mark Brown nous a présenté sur les oiseaux et les tortues des Seychelles. Donc, Mark Brown a passé plus de 40 ans à suivre les populations des oiseaux sur ces îles des Seychelles et en particulier sur l'île Cousine. Les îles Seychelles sont situées à l'est de Madagascar. Il y a 155 îles. L'île Cousin Island est une île privée de 25 hectares seulement, avec une altitude maximum de 75 mètres. On a créé une fondation pour conserver les oiseaux et la nature de ces îles. Et cette île est ouverte aux touristes depuis l'an 2000. C'est un tourisme de luxe, mais ce tourisme de luxe doit pouvoir, avec les revenus, financer les différents projets de restauration de l'île. Car il faut savoir que en 1960, cette île était une simple plantation de cocotiers avec plein d'animaux domestiques, des chèvres, des chats, etc. Et il a fallu des années, des décennies pour restaurer la végétation originelle. Essentiellement de 1985 à 1995, les travaux de restauration ont eu lieu et en 1998, on pouvait observer une végétation déjà bien naturelle avec même certaines parties bien développées. En 2020, une grande partie de la végétation est en plein essor encore, mais certaines parties ont même déjà atteint l'état climatique de la végétation. Alors justement, les revenus du tourisme sont utilisés pour la restauration et pour la conservation, en particulier de différentes espèces d'oiseaux. Il s'agit essentiellement d'oiseaux de mer, et ces oiseaux de mer ont la particularité d'être particulièrement sensibles au changement climatique. On parlera aussi brièvement des tortues marines. Et sur l'île a aussi lieu la formation de personnes qui doivent être aptes à prendre en charge les différents projets de restauration. L'île abrite 4 personnes en permanence qui sont là pour mettre en œuvre les différents projets développés. Alors, on parle de quelques espèces particulières. Vous m'excuserez d'utiliser les noms anglais de ces espèces. Je ne connais malheureusement pas les noms français. Peut-être que quelqu'un peut m'aider. Et sinon, vous trouverez certainement sur Google la manière de traduire ces différents noms anglais. Alors, parlons d'abord du Seychelles Magpie Robin, cet oiseau noir et blanc que nous avons vu tout à fait au début, qui était une espèce qui était devenue particulièrement rare. Et cette espèce-là est un des grands succès de la restauration des populations. Il existait sur une autre île des Seychelles, sur Frégate Island, finalement, au plus bas, 16 individus. Et c'est à partir de ces 16 individus dont on a pris 7 individus pour les réintroduire sur Cousin Island dans les années 90. Et de ces 7 individus qu'on a introduits sur Cousin Island, un est décédé et les autres se sont bien développés. Maintenant, on a des Magpie Robins sur plusieurs îles, je crois, si je me souviens bien, 6 ou 7 îles différentes. Il s'agit d'une population d'environ 100 individus sur les différentes îles, dont 76 se trouvent sur Cousin Island, donc la population la plus grande. Et Mark Brown nous a montré une carte des territoires de ces oiseaux qui sont étudiés de manière individuelle puisqu'on leur passe des bagues en couleur. Une autre espèce est le Seychelles Warbler, qui a une histoire similaire à l'espèce précédente. À partir de 29 individus, on est passé à une population de 400 individus. Il y a aussi eu une histoire avec un sort un peu moins favorable. S'il s'agit du Seychelles White-eye, qui a été aussi une des espèces qui était devenue très rare d'une manière générale et dont on a réintroduit 20 individus en 2007 sur Cousin Island, mais il s'est avéré que l'autre espèce très menacée, le magpie robin, avait pour mauvaise habitude de manger les jeunes de ce Seychelles White-eye, ce qui fait que l'essai de réintroduction de cette espèce a complètement a été complètement raté. Alors, on passe maintenant à quelques oiseaux de mer. Il y a le lessonodi, qui niche en très grande population de 55 000 couples sur Cousin Island. Ces oiseaux sont bagués et on a retrouvé des reprises d'oiseaux bagués de Madagascar, mais aussi des Philippines. Il y a aussi le brown noddy qui niche là-bas, environ 100 couples. C'est un oiseau qui niche dans les arbres ou au sol. Et une particularité de cette espèce est qu'ils ont des jeunes de différentes couleurs, donc des jeunes bruns et des jeunes blancs. Une autre espèce d'oiseau de mer, c'est le tropic bird, qui niche tout au long de l'année, qui pond un œuf au sol de la forêt. Il faut dire que tous ces oiseaux sont peu farouches et que c'est très pratique pour les étudier, car on peut les prendre, les soulever, les prendre en main, leur mettre la bague à la patte, prendre des mesures et quasiment les reposer sur leur œuf ou sur leur nid. On a parlé aussi de la white tern ou fairy tern, qui pondent des œufs sans nid, en des endroits même très risqués, simplement sur une branche, ce qui fait que, par exemple, quand il y a beaucoup de vent, beaucoup d'œufs sont perdus. Il y a aussi des shearwater qui nichent. D'une manière générale, la plupart de ces espèces ont des populations en augmentation. Et une des menaces importantes, cette question a été posée par Geoffrey tout à l'heure, avant que je commence le résumé. Donc, les changements climatiques sont un des facteurs de menace très importants pour ces populations d'oiseaux, surtout les oiseaux de mer. Et on a fait plusieurs projets d'études d'une part et aussi de manipulation pour essayer d'adapter les oiseaux à ces changements climatiques qui s'expriment essentiellement par des augmentations de la température ambiante. Alors, on a constaté que les oiseaux qui nichent en forêt sont bien moins susceptibles d'être exposés aux températures ambiantes en augmentation que les oiseaux qui nichent en dehors des forêts, qui nichent à découvert. Et on a constaté aussi qu'une simple variation de plus 1 degré en moyenne pouvait déjà avoir une influence sur le succès de reproduction. Quand on parle d'adaptation, on parle aussi du choix du site de nidification, et ainsi on a pu observer que, par exemple, en présentant aux fairy terns une demi-coquille de noix de coco pour poser son œuf, on augmentait énormément le succès de reproduction par rapport à sa reproduction où les oiseaux pondent un œuf simplement sur une branche et risquent vraiment de ne pas survivre longtemps. Le bagage a une grande importance et, par exemple, on a pu constater qu'un tropic bird bagué sur Cousin Island avait été repris en Inde. Un autre facteur de menace, c'est la pollution de plastique qui a énormément augmenté. On a pu constater entre 2003 et 2019 une augmentation énorme de pollution de plastique. Et par exemple, 10% de ce plastique trouvé sont tout simplement des sandales, des souliers jetés par les touristes. La formation joue un très grand rôle, on en a parlé. Quelques autres oiseaux de mer ont été aussi mentionnés, et aussi quelques oiseaux terrestres comme sunbird, quelques granivores, pigeons, râles. Et finalement, on a parlé des tortues marines, et là aussi, il s'agissait d'aider à faire augmenter le succès de reproduction lorsque des nids sont construits, enfin sont creusés à des endroits où la marée ou d'autres facteurs risquent de les détruire. Ces nids les œufs sont prélevés et sont mis dans un incubateur, et on a un très très bon succès de reproduction avec cet incubateur. Voilà, en quelques mots, c'est un espèce de résumé de cette très intéressante présentation par Mark Brown. Merci.